Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar about brand building after COVID and restoring trust through purpose and meaningful action. So we'll get started in just a couple moments here. I see we still have some attendees trickling in. So just hang tight for a second and then we'll get started with our panelists. Great, I think we can go ahead and get started now. So in this webinar, we have participants from UNICEF, Virgin Voyages, Mother, and myself from Delve. We'll offer best practices aimed at brand marketers who are trying to reimagine their brands in this interesting post-COVID world. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Shelley, let's start with you. Can you share your background and a little bit about your role at UNICEF?
Sure. My name is Shelley Diamond. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, not to be confused with big global UNICEF, although we work very closely together. And my job is to do all marketing and communications directed at external audiences.
Wonderful, thank you. Tamara, can you introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara Pluvios. I'm a Director of Marketing Technology at Virgin Voyages, and my focus is really about providing our marketing org with the right tools and insights to help them do their day-to-day jobs, especially specifically to our external audiences.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. I would love to hear a little bit more about your role.
Hi guys, I'm Katie Longmire. I'm the Managing Director at Mother New York. We're a creative agency, and my role is to help us steward our business and be a strategic business partners to our clients and partners, which include Panera, Target, and various others, to help us talk to our consumers in creative ways and use creativity to amplify the messaging and communication between them and their consumers.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Emma Marcotte. I'm the head of Delve's engagement consulting practice, so really focused on new and existing client services and how we can build strategic approaches and strategic branding for our clients to meet their goals. Awesome, well, we will jump right in then. So before we get started, I wanted to share a recent report from Kantar that really elegantly summarizes the state that institutions, so businesses, governments, media, non-governmental agencies, NGOs, find themselves in today. So I quote, "Millennials and Centennials expect brands to act as an example and guide change. This presents a unique opportunity for brands to serve as a force of positive change. However, the fact that these brands are regarded as role models amongst the younger generation is a double-edged sword. Any inconsistency between actions and words can be scrutinized and amplified." So now that I recognize there's a variety of different ways that we can address this kind of huge topic here and discuss the dilemma that, and opportunity, I should say, that brands are facing today. Brands are being pulled in a number of different directions. So for example, social mission, brands are really looked at to be a force for good, especially as there are a number of social issues just within the last year that brands have been expected to take a stance on and really come to the table with something interesting and meaningful to say. Expectations, brands are held to very high standards and really looked at as what we should all be aspiring to be. However, on the other side of the coin, there is risk and exposure. If brands aspire to be a force for good, but they don't meet expectations, they can kind of be canceled or really scrutinized, especially amongst the younger generation. And then revenue goals. At the end of the day, these are all businesses and they have revenue goals and shareholders typically that have expectations that they need to hold them to. So it's really an elusive balance between these four sources: social mission, expectations, risk, and potential exposure. And if expectations aren't met, and they need to ultimately make money. So how are we going to tackle that? That's quite the conundrum for brands these days. So we're excited to have you guys here, and I'd love to really get your reaction to these tensions. So Shelley, maybe I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on this dynamic here?
Well, of course, it's always really tricky, right? So you have your internal compass, and you have both your employees, the consumers who shop your brand, engage with your brand, and then you have shareholders, which certainly drive a lot of decisions that CEO makes. And I think one thing that's becoming obvious, that if you don't have a brand that stands for something meaningful, it's not good for shareholder value. And that's a big motivator for CEOs. So I think the old playbooks have to be ripped up, and you have to sort of think through what one means. Like when I started in the business, I was at Y&R for like almost 30 years, and I worked on a lot of wonderful brands, and we would do things that we felt were purpose. For breast cancer, putting a pink can on a pink ribbon on a can of soup, that doesn't cut it anymore. I mean, you literally have to stand for something. And if you do that, you have to understand going in that you have the stomach, the appetite, for potentially alienating one of those three tenets, whether it's your shareholders not living up to the expectations of your employees because they want you to do more. And you've seen that, especially around racial inequity and voting restrictions. I mean, organizations will have to stand up because there's an expectation, and they have enormous risks. So I think once you articulate with true authenticity what your mission is, identify the risks and how you're going to respond to those risks, and communicate as best you can with the organization and even with your board of directors so that they know what's coming, because they're usually the first point of conflict if it becomes a financial situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Katie, Tamara, I'd love to hear a little bit on what your guys' perspective are on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to follow what Shelley was saying is like that risk is a measurable risk, right? So, risk and reward is like when we talk about consumers, they're so aware now. All consumers are. They're tracking their dollar, not just to the actual product, but the pipeline of the product, the executive leadership of the product. So when, you have one of these arms pushing back on how you're going to show up in the world, what you have to do is say, here's the consequences of not having an end-to-end purpose-driven brand, or like making sure that we're pipelining and focusing on the things that people care about, and they will reward you financially. Yes, you'll have risk of loss in some areas, but the gain is so much higher. And I think the internal conversation that you often have to tackle is showing what that is. So like metrics and comparative with other brands in the category are really helpful to help you win those arguments. But ultimately, consumers are becoming like more than just activists now. They're like abolitionists. They will like remove things from the sphere that are not working, and in a positive way, and you have to participate with them.
Yeah.
And just to piggyback on that, I think the whole idea is, from a consumer standpoint, is the idea of choice. So they're looking across this depth and breadth of your competitors and really trying to understand what makes you different. And it's not about the slick marketing materials anymore. It is about like, what do you stand for? And I think to Shelley and Katie's point, knowing who you are as a brand, right? And staying true to that, and while overlaying what that means to your consumer, is a big key in that. So if you're able to take that risk, which of course has to be those internal conversations, but it also is very much so tied to the people who rode for you in the first place, who are already your consumers, already those people who shared interests as a lead. Like for us, we haven't sailed yet, right? But we do have fans. We do have people who know who we are as a brand and are looking for us to sail at some point. And if it ties back to that, the risk is actually, in my mind, minimal. Because if you are adhering to what you said and you've captured the right audience anyway, those people who end up kind of, being the negative or jeering you from that aren't that much of the factor, as much as staying true to who you are and making sure that that pulls through to your audience.
Yeah, I know one of the things that you had in your earlier slide was the notion of inconsistency between action and words. And I think both Tamara and Katie said this, and it's got to be at the top of the list. You can't be that organization that's going to be family friendly when you don't give your own employees maternity and paternity leaves. And the first thing people do when you make these bold statements is they make sure that you actually are putting your money where your mouth is. You're not just saying it to sell more product, but you actually are living it, that you're building it from the ground up. Your organization is built that way. A company like Lego, I mean, they are all about family. And so the products that they create, the purpose, messaging, and mission is completely synced up with how they built their business to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing your perspective on that. I think that really tees us up kind of to dive into the deeper sections of this here. So moving into the next slide. So let's talk through the agenda quickly. So we've broken up the webinar into 4 sections. So first we're going to talk about the why behind consumers' need for brands to lead change, then what can be done to actually lead that change, how this can be tackled within media channels to combat trust, and then finally kind of touch on that double-edged sword, the risk versus the reward, or risk versus opportunities. So let's jump into the first section here with the why behind consumers' desire for brands to lead change. So we wanted to share this stat. So why are businesses, governments, NGOs, media today more than ever being viewed as banner carriers who are supposed to help solve key societal issues, or at least have a strong stance on key societal issues such as climate change, racial inequity, children's health crisis, etc. So in preparation for the webinar, I did a pretty significant amount of research, and I wanted to share some of the reference points and details that I found, and then we'll get your guys' POV on this. So let's start with government. I've been reading, and I'm sure you guys are very much aware of this, most people are, that Americans have less and less trust in their elected government officials. And for example, in 1958, during the Eisenhower administration, about 73% of Americans said that they can trust the government in Washington to do just about always or most of the time do the correct next action. I think as we've seen now, this has really dropped off significantly over the course of the last 20 plus years. In this same poll in April of 2021, in the current Biden administration, the percentage is at about 24% of those who trust that the government will do the right thing most of the time or all of the time, which I find it's really interesting. I think this isn't something that just necessarily began during President Trump's presidency, where people were left on qualifications. Now it's kind of seeped into more of a new norm. We've seen, you know, this is spanning into 5-6 years of where this trend is continuing to decline, and where that really leaves the opportunity and the expectation of consumers is that large brands within the states and globally are expected to really step up to the plate and help regain that trust and provide a little bit of a beacon for consumers to understand what is right and what is just. So I guess what is your perspective on this trend? Katie, I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I mean, I think that trust is such a unique thing, right? And like, to Shelly's point, people are paying attention to if you're walking the walk and you're not just putting it in front of the, like, here's my product and I'm going to talk the way you talk and show up in the spaces that you show up so that you trust me. It's really infusion in every level, right? It's executive leadership and what that looks like your Lego reference is a really good thing. And I also think that like brands have this positioning where they influence the way culture moves. They influence what's happening in the world. So that's actually like a position you have to own as a brand. So like the bigger the brand, you know, the more impactful it is. So especially like if you look at what happened during COVID, for example, like brands that actually helped people and like created systems to protect and give safety allowed more trust and got rewarded with, like, you know, you look at quarterly reports and it's like off the charts. And I think that's the thing, is like it's a little bit of an ownership of like where you sit in the ecosystem and how you have to show up. Like it's a different positioning than brands had to take before, and I think that's what's so significant about trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Tamara, do you have any perspective on why you think that we are seeing this decline in trust from the government, or what is contributing to these factors?
I think when I look at this, if I put my analyst hat on from back in the day, something that also goes along with that trend, especially when you start looking at 2000s, is the increase of the internet, of social. So like you have all these various sources outside of the news that are now you're thinking are just like the end all be all. This is your source of truth. Or it's really confusing because you have 1,000 different things talking about the same thing with a very different lens, and it starts to confuse you, right? And so I think that's where trust may have eroded over time with what we think were the status quo, so government, so the media and things of that nature. And it has relied more on almost democratizing where you should have your true source of truth for things. And where that starts to really evolve is as companies started becoming more online, as companies started having more of a social presence to be where your consumer is. That's where we needed to play a stronger role, to Katie's point, on how we show up and what we say and the things that we do. So to me, it's not surprising. It was just more like if you probably overlay the use of like technology, smartphones, all these things, it'd probably be going up as the other things are going down. So how do you as a brand kind of take charge of that to, one, be consistent in what you're saying, but also be consistent across all the various ways that you can say it to somebody?
Yeah. It's funny, you look at the chart and, you know, Obama won the election, first president to use social media, digital media. It became sort of the campaign venue for everyone. Then of course it continued. And Katie said this, you know, brands have to sit at the intersection of culture and their own beliefs. And the fact of the matter is the culture of today is one of complete mistrust. And by the way, well earned, I must say. Beyond the social media, there's the environment that we're in now. You don't even know what a trusted source of information is. It used to be your most trusted source was your family and your friends, but they're getting their information from social media as well. And I think that it's just ironic to me to see, you know, Nixon, probably the least trustworthy president in our history. Government was more trusted then. So I think Mara is absolutely right. You know, the democratization of journalism, anyone can be sort of that source of information. And that is absolutely terrifying, but it opens up an opportunity for businesses to step up and say, okay, like we can be trusted. And I think about your CEO, Richard Brannigan. The Virgin, I think he was one of the, you know, the first CEOs that actually, you know, I heard him today on the news, even though he went to Mars or wherever he went to space. Mars is next. You know, he feels, and he's like, it is the responsibility of businesses to change the world. And so those CEOs, right? They have the power to make business a trusted source of positive change.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually tees us up really nicely in terms of your comments about the democratization of media and journalism. These stats, none of these I think will be surprising to any of the audience members or you or our panelists here, but 59% of people around the globe actually believe that journalists and reports are purposefully trying to mislead people by saying things that they know are false or gross exaggerations. I think really leaning into that gross exaggerations piece is an important element here. And then also 59% of people believe that news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than informing the public. And I think that really supports everything that you all were just saying, that this is a real reason why consumers are seeing, or trust from consumers is declining for very good reason, because they are just being infiltrated on all different sources, whether it be from the media outlets themselves or on social media from people getting, you know, their information from these media outlets, that there is ulterior motives here. And Shelley, to your point, that really gives an opportunity for brands to step up to the plate and to kind of be the heroes in the scenario with a North Star beacon to help guide consumers and help them understand where they should be going and what's right and wrong. What I am kind of interested in is I wonder what your guys' perspective on is what is leading to the less trust in news organizations. Maybe it's just the access of more information, but it is interesting to think about that trend is what beyond just the ability to get information in real time from a number of different sources, as we're all connected to the internet nearly every moment of our day, what else may have led to a decline in trust of news organizations?
I think it has to do with how consumers and the internet exploded. You know, clickbait is a thing. You know, headlines that are grabbing, that gather people, like, paper news. I love a paper newspaper, but, so many people are consuming their news in snippets on a news feed, via digital media. And so those platforms are challenged to get your eyeballs and keep them and then engage them. So that has to do with headlines and how you talk about things. That has to do with your point of view. And that skews more in an entertainment model than a tangible news model. And that's why the news cycle is so short as well. Like, what's the punchiest, most impactful way to talk to a consumer? That's when you're getting into the marketing space, right? So the power of a brand is, if they can maintain their authenticity, they can platform truth and honesty that is less about grabbing eyeballs. They already have loyal consumers and they can gather more. But like, if they have a consumer base that's already there, they can be in dialogue with them in an authentic way. But I do think that, like, being challenged to work on an entertainment model is what skewed lack of trust in news and the model that news is now trying to use to survive.
I think that you're exactly right. Like, and sorry, Shelley, if you were going to say something.
No. Please.
Like, the first thought that came to my mind is, with this explosion, right? There's a lot of noise. So people want to be or organizations, news, journalists, et cetera, want to be the people who stand out from the noise. And so how do you do that? You keep, doing the clickbaiting. You keep trying to do those grabs, almost like a honey trap, to get people to pay attention to what you're doing. And you want to be part of the latest thing, to your point about the short news cycle. And I think in the rush to be the first or the loudest, or to capture the most attention, I think some things fell through the wayside of the quality of the being able to kind of really just say that this is the true things. Or also you risk, you're trying to maybe cater to an audience because that's what you think is the right thing to say. And so that eventually, as exciting as it is as a short-term win, long-term, what you start to see are these things, the stats like you're displaying.
And I would just add really quickly 3 things. One, affirmation news. And I think we all like to listen to the news that affirm our position. And if you happen to have a very large base, you're not going to sort of change that approach. I think the other thing is extremism, right? So the extremes get all the attention. I think the more, I can't actually anymore think of, what, it's odd. I would say that the network news, the typical NBC, CBS, ABC network news probably does more reporting broadly than the cable news and certainly online news, because what they have is they've created these incredible niches, right? And that their audiences expect that extremism. And then news has become a spectator sport. And I think that's sort of what Katie was saying. Give me that headline that's going to be like, what, he did that again? It's just, and when Twitter is your source of news, it's boom, in, out, gone, but it's every second you're getting overwhelmed by these sound bites. It's like news is sound bites, and it's hard to trust that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for your thoughts on that. And I think that leads us nicely into another stat that I wanted to share here. So tying this all together and really tying it back to the businesses. So while 59% of people surveyed do not trust media, we see that a huge amount of people are wanting to put that trust in businesses and NGOs, and they're trusted more than government media. None of us are surprised by that stat, but to kind of loop it back, it does present a really unique opportunity for organizations to make a stance, to talk to their consumers in new ways, and really dive into areas that maybe they weren't present before, as it aligns to their brand guidelines. So, second, the vast majority of consumers specifically expect CEOs to step in and take the lead and be held accountable. And this kind of speaks to the point you made earlier about Richard Branson, Shelley. So as a reminder, we wanted to review these data points about the decline in trust of government and news orgs and the increased role of the CEO. So we really want to dive into the why behind the Kantar research that I shared initially. So meaning these data points can help us build a hypothesis based on the Kantar research that consumers, especially millennials and centennials, as mentioned at the beginning, are expecting businesses and NGOs to lead the change. So as we're starting to uncover the eroding trust in government, distrust in media. It's left really that trust void. And in some ways, businesses and NGOs are really the only institutions that are left standing in the consumer circle of trust without, depending on how they approach the conversation and how they enter themselves into the conversation. So I guess what is, and maybe Shelley, I'll turn it over to you first. What is your reaction to this insight? Does the fact that consumers are looking to businesses and NGOs to fill a void represent a threat, an opportunity, or maybe somewhere in between?
No, I am all for businesses stepping up. Again, Richard Branson. I mean, these Elon. I mean, some of these CEOs, whatever, but at least they're putting themselves out there. Elon Musk. People are, in many ways, CEOs are the new rock star, right? And as much as we say these generations are philanthropic, these generations also want to use the capital markets to make change. And we're a capitalist society. Use your money to make change. I mean, the fact is, when a big business and when they come together and they actually do something, I think that's the only way that we're going to get societal problems fixed. I mean, we're going to be out of money at a government level, so you better find a way to get businesses to, to work with nonprofits, as an example, to solve the problems of the world, right? If kids don't have access to education, there's not enough digital connectivity, right? So, and they've fallen so far behind. So the government's going to write yet another check. No, I mean, yes, that would be great too, but there's a million companies out there that should be stepping up and doing this. And that, I should stop, because it just makes me insane that we're not doing more of this. I think 100% of people should put the pressure on companies to make the change required to start having some massive transformations in some of the inequities that occur in this country and around the world, and particularly in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I couldn't agree more. And Shelley, to your point, it's really, I think you made an interesting point about CEOs of large organizations kind of being treated as, sometimes celebrities really, or like quasi-celebrities within the space. And they have what that means, or as I think about this, is they really have the attention of consumers, especially amongst the younger generation. And with that attention, they have then the opportunity to make change, build trust, be meaningful within the space, have a voice that drives for change on some of the larger issues. And, there's a multitude of issues that can be addressed by these CEOs and organizations more broadly.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say to Shelley's point, right? Yes, CEOs have become, I actually had that in my head when you said it, that they are the new rock stars, right? But I think, and forgive me, I can't remember if it was Shelley or Katie in the beginning where we talked about like the other side of the coin of like how you treat your employees, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not as far removed as people think from a business standpoint. Yes, capitalism, yes, our consumers put our money into us, and therefore that's why trust is related. But part of the reason that they want to look at that is that how do you treat your employees, right? Like a lot of these things that we're talking about with poverty, with the diversity and inclusion and all these things that come, these things impact your employees too. So it is a big, it does make sense to me that there is this expectation that the CEO ends up taking a role in that, or being that steward as head of a company to be able to tackle those types of issues and have a strong stance. Because I'm looking at you, like taking a step back from what I do, I'm looking at you as a consumer of your product, but I'm also looking at you as, if I'm putting that time and investment into your product or service, I want to know that what you're doing is ethical. I want to know that you're treating your people right, and that it is, to that point, that pull through, that authenticity that you claim to have is not just about me because I put money into your pockets, but also about the people who help make this company great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for the comments on that. Let's go ahead and move into our second section here. So what businesses and NGOs can do to actually lead that change. So I think we've established a good foundation, why it's needed. We're all in alignment there. What can actually be done to kind of start to lead that change? So In this section, I want to share a key piece of insight from the Edelman Trust Barometer report, which is very, very helpful on these sorts of topics. So this report mentions 4 key pillars or action items of how businesses and NGOs can help the society emerge from this so-called information bankruptcy. So 1, businesses must embrace its expanded mandate and expectations, taking meaningful actions, communicating meaningful actions. Societal leaders must lead with facts and act with empathy. So they must have the courage to come to the table with straight talk, but empathize with, the challenges and address people's fears associated with those challenges, provide trustworthy content that's not only trustworthy, but unbiased and reliable. I think that really ties back to some of the details we discussed earlier about the trust in media and it feeling like media is very biased in one way or another. And finally, institutions must partner with one another to solve issues. And this talks directly to what you were mentioning earlier, Shelley, that businesses, government, media, NGOs, they need to find a common place to take collective action against some of these societal problems. So I'd like to use this framework as the basis for our next discussion. So first, let me share one more piece of data with you. So here's examples of areas where consumers expect brands to lead change. So Edelman is calling these foundational problems that consumers are asking brands and NGOs to lead change on. For instance, improving healthcare, addressing poverty are all areas consumers expect brands to lean into. Personally, I have to admit, these are not the types of corporate missions that you're often hearing brands talk about. I think we've seen more and more in the last year, probably, brands starting to come to the table, but there is an expectation amongst consumers that they are addressing some of these more macro challenges, whether as a single brand or in partnership with other brands and even the government. And I'd love to ask you guys about how your brands or the brands you work with are planning to accomplish this hard task, emerging from information bankruptcy and using these foundational problems as examples. So before I turn it over to our panelists here, let me move on to the next slide to help facilitate this conversation. So again, for the benefit of the panelists and our attendees as well, on the left, you'll see 4 action items that businesses and NGOs can take a lead change and guide as an example. And on the right, we list the types of areas that consumers expect businesses and NGOs to incorporate into their mission. So let's talk about these one by one. So starting with principle number 1, the first principle on the left, businesses and NGOs must embrace their new mandate, but in that process, they should take action first and then communicate it next. So in the context of the brand or client, why is it important to first take action and only communicate it? Why not the other way around? Communicate it, then take action. And Shelley, maybe you can speak first on this one.
It would be a very dangerous thing to communicate it before you've taken an action. I mean, that would bring a brand down, and we can probably think of a few, and I can, I don't want to denigrate any of your clients, but there have been many brands who want to stand for example, paying a fair wage, because we know that's at the root cause of why people are experience extreme poverty and on and on and on. And then the first thing you do is you see that they don't pay their own employees a fair wage. So first, take care of your own house. Make sure that you have constructed your business to address the things that are important to your community, to your employees, to the planet Earth, and make sure you've got that at least roughly there. You don't have to have it fully solved, but you have to have an intent to do all those things, because they can't happen overnight. And then you can begin to communicate. But you should start with your internal communication before you take your message externally. Because people, as we talked about social media before, it takes them a half a second, to call what on you.
Absolutely. Tamara, Katie, do you guys have any POV on this based on your experience?
To Shelley's point, this doesn't happen overnight. And I think one of the criticisms you see from consumers is brands saying, we're going to do XYZ, or we stand for XYZ. And then consumers immediately jump on them when they don't feel like they see the change. One of the things we talk to our clients about is like inviting people along the journey with you. So, or inviting your consumers to participate in what you're doing. So you set the intention, and to Shelley's point, you have to do it internally first. Like, how do you vocalize that you're intending to make this change with your employees, and how do you ask them to contribute? But then say, we have this intention, we're going toward this goal, and please hold us accountable. So, you know, there's a lot of like diversity reporting people are starting to put out, and they're like owning that, like, hey, you should see us quarterly and see what we're doing, and we're going to put it out, because once it's out there in the world, you're going to be able to see us and hold us accountable for it. So I think that's one of the ways that you can take action and growth at the same time, because it's impossible. You know, there's pipeline issues, there's infrastructures that have been there forever, that when you turn the lights on, you have to change the infrastructure as well as move forward towards change. And so in order to do both, you have to grow slowly and with intention. And the best way to do that is to invite the consumers into the journey, show them that you're doing it, report on it, have a dialogue with them about accountability. And you're not always going to get it right, but when you do that with somewhat transparency, I think you're allowing for people to see the intended growth and the result.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And what I would say here is, you know, just speaking from a specific brand with Virgin, you know, our brand credo has always been about transparency as well. And when a lot of the racial inequality and injustice conversations were happening last year and are still on the forefront today, one of the biggest things that we wanted to make sure as a brand that we didn't do, to Katie and to Shelley's point, is we didn't want to be the person that just put the black box on social and then you never heard about anything again, because the backlash and the mini cancellations that were happening, because people were quick to call you on it, and even the news sometimes was, you know, capturing that. It was more about, okay, so before we took a stance as a brand, we definitely had these conversations internally. Like, what should we be looking at? It's inward and outward. Yes, we support this initiative, but also, are we doing things internally to look at that? And so that's what we wanted to make sure that we had our house in order, essentially, before we started to communicate where our stance was and what we're doing. So it wasn't just about, yes, we support XYZ, or yes, we support donating to these causes. It was also about, hey, we're also having these conversations internally. We're making sure that we're putting that in the forefront with our employees. And we communicated that externally to our consumers, so they know that it wasn't just us talking the talk. And I think that's where it, to Katie's point, it is a combination of the setup, but also doing that in parallel, you know, because no one's going to get it perfect, to your point, but it's also about, like, how do you specifically be as open and transparent and communicate these things to not just your internal stakeholders, but ultimately our big bosses, which are the consumers, and how that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for your perspective on that. Very informative. So let's move along to the second principle here. Leaders of business and NGOs should lead with facts, but act with empathy. So I wonder if there's just kind of an inherent tension between facts and empathy, knowing they kind of do sit on the opposite side of the spectrum, but do need to work together. For example, I can imagine a business leader who does lead with facts, but does not act with empathy, or vice versa. And it seems clear that both are needed from both leaders and brands more broadly to communicate. So I'm wondering, what is your POV on that? And Katie, maybe we'll start with you here, and we'll probably just ask one panelist on these for sake of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. You know, when I think about facts and empathy, I think about transformational change.
Yeah.
Like turning a company around, because I think a lot of companies are in that position right now. They've existed in systems and architecture that has been there for a really long time, and that architecture no longer serves society and consumers. So there's an empathetic aspect to, like, you have a bunch of people who contributed to the success of that company, loyal consumers, all of these things are in place, and you have to uproot a lot of what's there. So, you know, I think that goes back to transparency. I do think that, like, to me, transparency in change when you're delivering facts is where the empathy shows up. There's some kind of Venn diagram there that I couldn't describe. But, you know, it's just sort of like ownership of the situation that you're in, ownership of the way the world is. Those two things are misaligned. Company, like, you know, capitalism architecture as it is currently built and the way the world has shifted in the past 15 months is not the same. And owning that, acknowledging that, and then finding that intersection of growth is really important. And the transparency of the growth areas and like how you need to tackle them and the transparency of how you communicate with that internally and externally, I think is where the empathy sits. And that's a very delicate line. You know, people who, to Mira's point, like say it the wrong way, they'll get canceled in 2 seconds. You can't move quickly. You're probably not going to get it right all the time. But I think there's a timing and languaging around it that is the empathy success lane that we would look for. And I think that's where you're going to find the most success. And I actually think that's where you're going to find the most forgiveness as you're moving. And, you know, and that's what I see from consumers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's very helpful. Thank you, Katie. So moving along to the third principle, businesses and NGOs should need to provide content that is truthful, unbiased, and reliable. I feel like we keep coming back to this topic because it just is such an essential element. So what is the process that you follow to ensure that all content follows these principles, and maybe any lessons that you've learned? And Tamara, maybe I can turn it over to you first to give your take on this.
Sure. I think from a process standpoint, the way that we look at it internally is there's always this umbrella, right? Like at the end of the day, it starts with what is it that we want to, what is it that we're talking about? How do we want to talk about it? How do we make sure? It's almost like I call her the Sherpa connector. She's our brand connections person, but that person is who brings all the people together and makes sure that everything is consistent as a whole. Like, sorry to get into the process conversation. I know sometimes people can be like, oh my God, process, but it is really about getting your ducks in a row before you do anything to make sure that what is it that I want to say? How do I want to say it? Where do I want to say it? And let's make sure that we're saying the same things across the board so that we can, you know, when it does go out there, it's consistent. Because the biggest thing for me is receipts. Like people will pull out a screenshot and call you out in a second, and that is their right to. Like if they're really have those expectations, they should do it. But if you come at it the right way with this almost brand umbrella of what is your perspective and how that flows across the way, that helps you to alleviate the idea of this inconsistent and information that you'll have across channels, at least for your own channels. You can't control what other people do with your content, but at least for your own channel, you'll be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that consistency, to your point, having that very strong brand voice across the board helps to dive into the trust and make change, or at least drive, you know, a perception change with consumers where these elements are so important to them when they're choosing what brands they want to support and what brands they want to be loyal to, really. Moving on to our final principle here, businesses and NGOs should partner with one another, find a common person, and take a collective stance. So Shelley, I think I'll turn this one over to you because I know that you have, as we all do really, have a strong opinion on this one. Can you share some examples where brands, where your brand or client is partnering with others to find a common purpose, or an example of what you could see as a fit there?
Yeah, I mean, in the world of NGOs, if you're not partnering with business, then you are just not providing the scale and the immediacy. So the pandemic was a time where it hit us all globally. I mean, who could possibly have been prepared for that? And as we began our responding to the pandemic, you needed to convene not only businesses, governments, the media, in order to start seeing some seismic shifts in how we behave. And so I'll just pick a couple because you asked for some examples. So in the area of education, I think I mentioned this to you before, but we have children on the move. They're going from refugee camp to refugee camp. They're in a refugee camp, they're learning. They have to move. They move to the next refugee camp. Now they can take their curriculum with them because working with Microsoft, they developed something called the Learning Passport, which allowed their curriculum to be stored in the cloud so that the teachers at the next refugee camp could pull up the curriculum, what the children had been learning, and to the best of their ability, at least keep it continuous, and so that they wouldn't, be significantly set back. Another example on education is finding ways to connect children digitally to learning. which is really, really hard to do. And there's significant efforts going on between UNICEF and large corporations who can actually make that happen at scale. In the world of fake news, and I think you'll find this sort of interesting, we partnered with Facebook, the source of so much fake news. And the biggest issue we had is around vaccine hesitancy. And I think you guys already know this. So much of the misinformation on vaccines is being communicated through Facebook. But this country, not so much, I mean, it is, but nothing compared to the rest of the world. Where in some parts of the world, that is the only source of information. So Facebook stepped up and they provided a significant grant for us to work with them to place true, and it goes to your second point, authentic, true stories about what vaccines can do to save lives. Coming from UNICEF that has vaccinated almost half the world's children's population, it's a trusted source of information. And in countries where the government has worked with UNICEF to distribute vaccines, people believe it. Working with their religious leaders in these local communities, they believe it. But then having Facebook as that platform to communicate is a really powerful way to partner with a business that caused the problem but wants to stand up and solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Well, I really appreciate the different thoughts on this. All of your insights were extremely helpful as people are trying to understand and navigate this space. So let's go ahead and move into our third section here, and this one's a little bit shorter. So how businesses and NGOs should tackle their media channels to combat trust. So we've been talking about this trust theme throughout and talking about how at a macro level businesses approach this, but how can this be distilled down a bit more to specific marketing tactics and media channels? So before we jump into our panelists' perspective, I'd like to share just one more stat here from the Edelman, or one more chart rather, from the Edelman Trust Barometer. So in the Edelman Trust Barometer, asked respondents, when looking for general news and information, how much would you trust each type of source for general news and information? And to clarify the data that we see on the screen, consumers aren't just distrustful of media companies, they're distrustful of the channels where media companies post their content. So I think this ties back, Shelley, to the comments you were just making about Facebook and fake news and how companies are participating in those channels. So I'm wondering if this distrust in media companies and their media channels is kind of rubbing off on business, or how that is being approached from a macro marketing approach for businesses. So Katie, I'd love to get your perspective if you have any examples from specific clients.
Brand channel communications is so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the conversation we were having before about getting eyeballs and maintaining them, and the clickbait and the dynamics, and like consumers are smart. They know that that's happening. So how they're getting their information and what channel they're going on, is that's always going to be a point of contention, and like a search engine to them, and we know this isn't fully true, but is democratized, right? Like I can go to a search engine and get multiple sources, arguably. I actually always advise, hey, like look up multiple sources, use multiple search engines, and what populates is different. And we're learning that about, how these things are built. But I think that's probably why that's at the top of the list. I'm actually surprised that stuff like Twitter is at the bottom of the list, because we know that there are things that happen in the world that we don't get news from, that we hear from people on the ground who manage to get tweets out. And I actually find that when you talk to people who work in these spaces, like news spaces, they go to Twitter to source on the ground information. So I'm surprised to see that, but I also understand that there's so much opinion in a tweet that maybe that, and consumers are smart enough to know that, like that's how they're expressing. So maybe they receive it that way. So I think that's an interesting aspect about how people are absorbing this stuff. I mean, I think there's something to be said for the future state, which is like think about an NFT or a blockchain way of consuming information, which I think a lot of people are looking at it in just an artistic way, but there's an aspect of the blockchain that gives end-to-end encryption and confirms like the input and the output, and and something being non-fungible as a product or a tool can be more secure and democratized when you use that type of technology. So I'm actually curious, just to look at a future state of what this is how information could be funneled in that way to gain more trust. But yeah, that's sort of what I'm looking at when I see this.
Yeah, tying that back to blockchain is very interesting, because you have it's not being used or really necessarily looked at in that perspective right now, but the technology that it presents does present opportunity, and I would not be surprised if we start to move that way in the future as trust in media and fake news and all these different concerns continue to rise. Those aren't going away. We all know that. I'd love to see from the brand perspective, Shelley or Tamara, if you guys have a perspective on this and how this is thought about within your marketing strategies and plans.
So I actually was really surprised to see search go down.
Yeah.
Like traditional doesn't shock me, as social actually surprised me too, Katie. Like I definitely was like, oh, that's weird. But I guess that makes sense to your point about, like, you know, the opinionated tweets and things like that. What I would say is, you know, there's a lot of savvy consumers out there now. They recognize what is an ad, what is clickbait as well. And that's what I thought of immediately once I got over the surprise of the search engine part, because that is supposed to be the higher intent. Like, you own your own destiny of what you're searching for and what you're looking for and what you choose to click on. So I think the fact that people are more ad savvy, you know, about like what we're owning or paying for versus what they can organically get to be trusted sources is probably what's driving a lot of this. And what I would say is, you know, there's only so much that you can do if it's on the decline. It is still more about adhering to being consistent on your own channels. Like, those sources are those sources. Trying to fight that is like, you know, I forget what the metaphor is, but it's like beating your head against a wall. Like, you're not going to win that fight, but it does make sense to me, it feels like you just need to looking at this, you need to reinforce what you have and what you own and making sure that that's consistent. And to what Shelley was talking about in the previous slide, who you partner with as well. So like, because they're also going to have pieces of that. So the partnership piece and making sure it's consistent and that it is part of that authentic version of your brand is out there is really more, to me, what I think about when I see how everything else is on the decline.
Yeah, it's funny because it's been on first of all, it was never very good, right? You know, in the case of owned media, it was at 42, it's at 41. So it sort of started off in a fairly bad place. So I would say a couple of things. One, I think one of the major reasons you're seeing a steep decline is because of the election and politics. I mean, there's never been more use of social media than, not just social media, digital media, than during our election time. Misused, certainly tons and tons and tons of money being spent. So I think that absolutely colors people's impressions. The second thing is data privacy. There's so much conversation, and maybe this is inside baseball, around a cookieless world. Emma, you talked about it yesterday, but people know that their data is being used, and it really pisses them off. And I'm sure that's the search. I search, now all of a sudden I'm getting, you know, I search for a pair of shoes, and now shoes won't leave me alone. Like, I'm not already, but worse than that, I give money to a particular candidate, and then that candidate, their mother, their father, their grandfather, and every other person who shares their political beliefs, a congressman in another part of a country that, you know, I live nowhere near, wants me to, you know, donate to their campaign. So I think a lot of it is just that. I think from our point of view, how are we going to sort of fight it? I think everyone said it's the company you keep, right? It's insurances that we are maintaining your data privacy, and that what we give you on those channels has some meaning for you, right? You know, give me, and we talked about this yesterday, more personalized communication. If I'm interested in helping children in Syria, and that's what you want to talk to me about, I'm probably gonna sort of engage with you and ultimately trust you. If you're just giving me things that are clearly something I'm not interested in, or in the case of an NGO, you're just chasing me down to make a donation, that's not going to help either. So I think you have to be very respectful of people's wishes, and we have an opportunity to know what they are because of data technology. Tamara, you talked about this, it's your area, and I'm sure in the world that you live in that you guys are thinking about that all the time. But it's, you know, it's bad, but it was never good, so maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that notion of respect is as it infiltrates across the board. I think data, to your point, Shelley, is really key here. Data can be used for the power of good. Data can be used for the power of bad. It depends on how you're using it and how you are respecting your consumers and your audience first, as opposed to having it be an afterthought, knowing that we have a wealth of data today to speak to our audiences. Are you using it for good or arguably for evil? So let's take that. I know that we're coming up on time here, so let's take this into our final section here, just tying it back to that juxtaposition of the risks versus the opportunities, leaning into the leading change. So I'll turn it over to the panelists, and I would say let's kind of treat this as our final remarks here, knowing that we just have about 4 minutes left. Would love to get your perspective on, all the different things we've talked about. We know that this presents a ton of opportunity, but kind of what are the risks that are associated with it, and how do you see brands finding that balance between the two as they move forward? And Katie, maybe I'll turn it over to you first.
I think the risk is not taking risks. You have nothing but opportunity and possibility right now. Consumers are asking for change. They want to see different movements. The ask, like any company that's been positioned in a way where it felt like it was risky to make transformational or significant change is now being challenged to do so. So the actual risk is not doing so. So I would give them that platform. It does require heavy internal awareness, alignment, discussion, and probably difficult change. But any brand that is willing to take that step will be rewarded.
Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Shelley, Tamara, any thoughts there? Final statements on this topic?
What Katie said, you can't not take a position. You cannot. You cannot avoid taking a stand. You have to be bold. You have to be willing to go beyond purpose. I always say activism, but you had a better one. What did you say, Katie? Got to go beyond that. Yeah, you got to come. All right, I have to add that to my repertoire. But when you have brands like Old Navy, taking a stand around feminism or around racial inequity, you have to take an authentic position. It's not a marketing strategy, it's a business strategy. If you want to drive your business, then you have to understand that to inform your brand purpose, you have to commit to your brand ideals. And that means you have to challenge conventions. That means you have to be willing to take a risk. That means you have to be prepared for the blowback if the risk was too great. And the good news is that we live in a digital world. You can put your toe in the water. People have 11 seconds before they forget what you just said, and you can check it out. But if you don't take a position, then you will not have one as a brand. And brands who have no position ultimately disappear into the ether.
Absolutely.
I don't know how to add to Shelley. I wholeheartedly agree. The only risk that I could ever see in this is doing what we talked about in relation to the media, right? Like one of the things that degraded the trust there was they were trying to be the noisiest and comb through the noise. And so don't lose yourself as a brand or what you stand for because you're trying to just like catch up or keep up or be the loudest. But it is, to me, outside of that piece, nothing but opportunity. And the fact of the matter is, if you do adhere to the point of like what you stand for and what your consumers are about, the risk is minimal.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really excellent way for us to wrap up today and just kind of tie all these pieces together. I could not agree more with everything that our panelists said. And I just want to thank you three, Shelley, Katie, Tamara, for participating and for your thoughtful comments. I know this was really, really helpful for me, and I'm sure it was really wonderful to listen in from our attendees as well. So with that, we will wrap up. Thank you so much for the time today. And we will be sending out a link of this to the attendees, to those who registered, if anyone was not able to participate. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And it was great meeting you, Tamara and Katie. And thank you, Emma.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.